Good afternoon. I'm Ken Anderson. I'm the visiting James Way Professor in the Keller Center this year. I have the delight to be able to bring you or be the moderator for the spring series of Humanistic Design Speaker Talks. And today we have Janet Vertesi. For those who don't know, the speaker series, the Humanistic Design Speaker Series, is sponsored by Keller Center. And the background for it is that the problems that we face today are really indeed complex, if not frickin' wicked, around gender equality, water scarcity, sustainability, climate change, social justice. You can go on for a long time on the kinds of problems we have. The point of view of the series is that in order to make progress on any of these, we need a robust partnership between the humanities, the sciences, the social sciences, and technology. And no better place for that to happen than at Princeton. The series is bringing in mostly people from the outside to help highlight different kinds of activities happening in the space. Today, though, we're delighted to have Janet Vertesi here, who is in the sociology department at Princeton. I will read just, I've known Janet probably 20 years, since she was like a little graduate student kid. And so it's kind of odd. I'm going to do the more formal approach to that, which is, I will say I'm an anthropologist by training, and Janet's been dubbed the Margaret Mead among the Starfleet, which is quite an honor if you happen to be an anthropologist. She has spent the last 2 decades studying NASA, robotic space teams. She'll be sharing some of that work today, as you can see on her slide. And the other part of her work that I love her for is she's been a conscientious objector around the personal data economy. And I think she's going to talk about that today, too. So you'll find out what that means. And then finally, I just mentioned that she's also written several really excellent books, including Seeing Like a Rover and the Shaping of Science, as well as Digital STS, and MIT Press's Infrastructure Series, has been an editor there. So I will turn it over to Janet, who's going to highlight in their talk, I'll let her talk about our talk, but is taking really the point of view of humanistic design, which is all about how frequently we talk about ethics and unintended consequences in the academic circles, but if we start focusing on sociology or anthropology or society first, we can start having different conversations. Janet.
Thank you so much, Ken. Is this mic on? Thank you. And it's really great to be here, and it's great to see so many familiar faces, and wonderful to see you in the room. And also, thanks to Keller, which is really sort of a home for me on campus. It's one of those unusual interdisciplinary people who engage as a social scientist and also in system design and building. So I appreciate you being with me today, as I'm going to attempt to synthesize across about 20 years of a professional career in what I'm coming to see as a form of a kind of applied sociology. That is a form of practice that's centered around socio-technical systems and design, but essentially premised in some of the core principles of sociology. So it should be, of course, no surprise to anyone in this room that we're living through this unprecedented era of techlash. And like my colleague Gil Ayala at Columbia says about the crisis of expertise, this is happening both because we are extensively, incredibly reliant upon technologies, and yet also at the same time incredibly skeptical of them and distrustful. And that distrust is at an all-time high. Now, when you talk to people in the tech sector about what the problem is and what their solutions are, they typically come down to 3 major approaches that I'll synthesize here. One is the bad apples approach, and that is the notion that there's just some people that are bad actors on the system, and we can't control them. And it could even be the CEO or the guy who just bought our company, our social media company. Maybe they're a bad apple. We can't do much about that. We've done all that we can. Now what we need is good regulation so that the hammer of the law can come down upon these people. We're not really responsible. That takes a really individualistic approach, again, to thinking about how these technologies intersect with society, that there are just going to be bad people that hijack them. Another approach is what I'll sort of call here the nudge, which is using individualistic notions from psychology to better design systems. This has been a major thrust in human-computer interaction for about 40 years. And the idea here is that you can use what we know about the human perceptual apparatus and about human neurology to build the kinds of devices that will synergize with our lives and our perceptual apparatus. And if you were taking symbolic systems at Stanford in the early 2000s, like my cousin's husband who founded Instagram, or my husband's cousin's husband who founded Instagram, you would have taken a class with a psychologist who taught you how to hack perception. Which is the reason why all of your notifications won't leave you alone on your phone and why we all feel like we're behaviorally now addicted to our phones and smartphones are the problem. Now, maybe the idea here is we should use some better psychology to like nudge people in the right direction, maybe with some applied behavioral economics to make it so that people will be better actors on these systems. And another approach is the ethics approach, which says maybe the problem is engineers just aren't ethicists, so they make unethical decisions. And we should just train them in ethics because then when they're in the room making decisions, they'll make more ethical decisions. No concept of the corporate culture or any other kinds of incentives, but they'll just be more ethical. So we should run the trolley problem a lot because we can like build that into our self-driving cars and it will be more ethical. Now, all of these issues come down to a misplaced assumption about the relationship between technology and society. First of all, that technologies can kind of come in and sort of hijack societies or hijack individuals. But secondly, that they're highly individualistic responses. The bad apples, the psychology, even the bad ethicist, these are all ways of interacting with individuals. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say there is no law of unintended consequences when it comes to technology and society. There are many, many uninformed decisions. There's a lot of selective or strategic listening, and I'm happy to go into questions and answers about moments where I've seen that happen with AI and the data economy in particular. And there's a lot of name calling and finger pointing. But maybe the problem is that our explanations and our premises for designing technology and society are false from the beginning. I'll argue that they're false largely because they rely on these individualistic framings and not on a society-first framing. That when you think individually, we only have ideas about how humans behave as individuals. Now, of course, that is central to our legal systems and to many of our institutions and to our culture in the United States. But you have to know that humans behave differently when they're put in groups. And they behave differently when they're put in different groups. And that certain social groups have structures and cultures that reinforce decision-making and behavior in specific ways. And this may depart significantly from individualistic or bad apples or ethical kinds of thinking. These pressures are fortunately very well described in a series of social sciences that focus on people in groups and in societies. And they make, when you have that perspective, they make so many of these problems that we've seen with technology, not just like emergent or uncontrollable, but utterly obvious in advance for anyone who knows how social groups work. So I'm going to argue for the value of what I'm calling a society-first approach to the design of socio-technical systems. And that means that we should rely on sociology and cultural anthropology, as these have a body of theory and practice that focus on groups, societies, institutions, and organizations. And here the attention is to structure and to culture and how that influences human behavior, again, in groups, not as individuals. There's three values here for design. The first is that social theory allows for the extensibility or the generalization of findings. Social theory is not like, I have a theory about things. Social theory is like the theory of gravity. It's like the theory of evolution. These are descriptive and also predictive, regularly observed laws about how people behave in groups with certain kinds of properties that underline those groups. And so if we can actually structurally use social theory, we can generalize across a variety of different locations and figure out where and how these technologies apply to different settings. The sociology and anthropology also bring to bear a variety of techniques and practices for empirical work with groups, sustained engagement with communities, but also reflexivity is a core part of the method. And the other advantage is that the sociology and cultural anthropology have been a hotbed of theorizing about the relationship between society and technology. My own PhD is in a program called Science and Technology Studies. This is a field that has been around for 50 years that has very clear, very robust and explanatory, like normative, predictive things to say about the relationship between social groups and technologies. This is not even rocket science anymore. People, like, we're already here. Another way to think about the society first approach is what I'm thinking about as a kind of inputs as opposed to impact. So otherwise, we kind of go around with this idea that technology impacts us like the meteorite hitting the dinosaurs, and you better just figure it out or you're going to go extinct, you know? And I find that that's so much a part of our common ideology and rhetoric that we've forgotten that we need to look the other way around, at the inputs to technology, not just the impacts. That is, what kinds of social ingredients, not just values or premises of efficiency, go into making strong socio-technical groups and communities? How can we infrastructure for the kinds of societies that we want to see, not what kind of impact would some technology coming from out of the blue have upon this community of practice? So not the impact of tech on society, but the inputs of society on technology. Now here I am clearly indebted in my approach to work in critical studies in human-computer interaction, largely the critical technical practice community, which frequently takes not only like sort of cultural values, but also cultural critique and a critical theory as an essential ingredient for design, and value-centered or value-sensitive design approaches that also are very articulate about which values that they should design for as a premise in their technological systems. And what I love about these approaches is that they demonstrate that we can not only analyze problems and systems today, we can build tools that center different premises and bring those possibilities into being. Now, the difference here that I would argue is that I'm not just talking about critical theory or critical theorizing, but centering around social theory about how humans behave in groups. So I'm going to, for the rest of the talk, draw on 3 examples from my own work, first with NASA spacecraft teams, and then from the opt-out project, opting out of data collecting practices, and a little bit from the anti-racist technology class I taught at Princeton, to articulate ways in which we might put society first in technology design. So what these 3, what seem like entirely different topical spaces have in common, I would argue, is a premising upon social theories that describe and predict human behavior in groups, that they take a social constructivist approach to technology, that is that we in communities can design the technologies we want, input as opposed to impact, and sustained empirical work often involving reflexivity and community interaction in a variety of ways. So with that preamble out of the way, let me tell you a little bit about some of the work I've been doing for the last also 20 years with, first of all, robotic spacecraft teams at NASA. Now, one of my capstone projects that I'm well known for in this community and in sociology is a comparative study of 2 robotic spacecraft teams. And I recently published this in a book called Shaping Science that you can look up. I'm totally happy to hear what you think of it if you manage to find it and read it. But basically what I did was study as an ethnographer embedded with 2 different robotic spacecraft teams. They took place at the same time and involved the same institutions, but they had 2 radically different social organizations. One of them, the mission to Mars, was organized under a strong central leader who used his role to produce a flat hierarchy among the team with a radical collectivist orientation towards the sharing of resources and a consensus-based culture in which total agreement was essential before they moved forward based on for decisions for what the robot would do the next day. And this was going on at exactly the same time as across the other side of the asteroid belt, a community was exploring Saturn using their spacecraft. And that one was organized entirely differently, as different sort of bureaucratized, siloed different groups associated with specific instruments, that those instruments negotiated heavily for time and for resources on the spacecraft using more of a game theoretic and zero-sum approach. And each group was it was kind of a federation system where each group fiercely defended their own autonomy and their ability to make decisions and negotiate for resources in the way that was right for them. So the issue here is not which of these is better, but what are they each good at? What are they optimized for? What is it like to work in these totally different structures and cultures? And what can we learn from that for design? So I'll mention that these 2 different systems were not only structured differently, they also had radically different cultural orientations. And it was possible to spend the morning on Mars and hear someone speaking in a specific way and then totally change in the afternoon as they worked on Saturn, right? And so you would think, well, what happened if this person just had a personality transplant in front of my eyes? But it's largely because they were code switching between these 2 different cultural frames. So on the Saturn team, I heard often that it was really important to respect the independence of these different groups. It's like the United States. Everyone has their own states. states' rights. We should do it differently, and that should be important. But that this was also important for the conduct of good science, because they believed that science wouldn't be done well if everyone just agreed not to disagree with each other. It was better to have radical points of disagreement and departure to do better science. But what this also meant is that coordinating observations between different parts of the spacecraft and its different instruments became a big political issue as well as a technical issue. So the communities that managed the infrared instrument and the ultraviolet instrument didn't really talk to each other, but also their instruments were placed on different sides of the spacecraft, so you couldn't look at Saturn in both the ultraviolet and infrared at the same time. In fact, I sat in on those meetings where they finally tried to do that, and it took about 1.5 years to figure out how. And that isn't just because people are stubborn or frustrating, it's because you're working against that socio-technical, cultural, and structural orientation of the team. Meanwhile, on Mars, at exactly the same time, the rhetoric was entirely different. People would describe how if you limited yourself to one instrument, that would be incredibly foolish for the science, because in fact, the science required them all moving together as one team. This, of course, naturalized the collectivist and consensus orientation of the mission, but it also upheld the way that they thought about their own robot, that the robot was the glue binding the team together into this continual consensus framework. And the kind of language that they used to talk about the planning process wasn't a kind of blood on the floor or mine versus yours, but instead a notion of ownership, that negotiation was about empowerment of the team to feel like part of the process. Now, this is, again, the same time, the same people, the same institutions, but these two different structures and cultures. And the main insight of the book was that this was powerful, not because one was better than the other, but because they were better at different things. And specifically, that the structures and cultures of the team shaped the different kinds of scientific questions they could answer and ask. That on the Mars team, the fact that the data was shared, the instrument suite was built together at the same time, and that it supported this synergistic investigation meant that you could ask questions of a single rock on Mars and use all of your instruments to solve that problem. Meanwhile, it was really difficult for the Martians to say, okay, let's look at the infrared scans of all the rocks in the region, because that wouldn't have made it through the consensus-based process. But on Saturn, it was absolutely possible to say, let's just do infrared of the rings. I will fight for that time every week so that we can look at that over 5 years and have data about that. But it was very difficult to get this synergistic view. So it allowed them to ask and answer different scientific questions, and it also predicted the ways in which team members shared data. So neither team adopted the kind of information wants to be free. Sometimes they did make an appeal to the fact that this was publicly funded science, so it should be publicly available data. More importantly, the way the data circulated supported those different social and cultural orientations. So the way that data circulated on the Saturn mission was between the small groups of the instruments, and the way that it circulated on the Mars team was as a collective resource shared by everyone on the team. Finally, because these team members built their own robots, they built the robots to support the orientation of the team, that supported the way that they thought was the best way to do science, that supported the way they thought was the responsible way to share data on their communities, and that ultimately underlined instead of undermined the way that they wanted to do their work on the planets. So what this means is they didn't encounter the robots and have that be a major challenge. Instead, the robots kind of naturalized themselves the ways in which these teams work. So that's a major summary of a long book project that took about 10 years to do. But I do want to let you know that this shouldn't be too surprising from the perspective of social theory. And that is because there's a number of things that we know that we apply to understanding these two different socio-technical systems. One is from Emil Durkheim, a founding figure in sociology 125 years ago, who said that the way we organize our groups and divide up labor changes the way we feel about each other. It changes and shifts our sense of social cohesion and how and what we share and with who. As he famously says, and I always tell my students, the family doesn't do things for each other because they love each other because they do things for each other. So for Durkheim, the organization is key, a predicate for how information is shared and how people feel like they're part of the United States and states' rights, or if they feel like the robot is the glue. We also know from studies in socioeconomics, going back to Marx, but going through to the present day, that the value of any currency, including data, arises from its relations of exchange. That is, data doesn't have a value in and of itself, but rather it has value based on how it circulates in the relationships among a community. There are many different kinds of relationships of exchange that are possible. You may have heard of a gift economy. That functions very differently than, say, purchasing things from the market or, cryptocurrency or whatever. But these are really different sort of social organizational frames that predicate how data moves and also how people sort of feel about each other at the same time. Finally, let me point to the work of John Law, who's a theorist from the sociology of science, who has this concept of heterogeneous engineering. What he says is that engineers are not just building technical systems, at the same time they're building social systems and social relations, whether they know it or not. And on these teams, what we noticed, or what I noticed, was that people were building the robots that supported the social orientation of the team. So they were engaged in a kind of heterogeneous engineering without maybe knowing exactly where that would end up, but largely to reinforce their own structures. So that's a sort of summary of this approach, but here's what we know from social theory. So what happens if you need to design the next spacecraft? And this is precisely what happened when I was approached by the leaders of the Europa Clipper team. Europa is launching this fall to the icy moon around Jupiter. It'll launch in October. And here it is in the high bay last week at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, totally assembled and ready to go. But the problem that Europa Clipper had is this. Many of their scientists came from the Saturn mission, so they were totally used to doing science that way. And they were building a large orbiter, kind of a lot like the Saturn mission too. But they had to do Mars-style science. And that's because the problem they're trying to investigate is the habitability or the possibility of life on Europa. Europa is an icy moon that is orbiting Jupiter out there in the outer solar system, and it has the qualities, the ingredients for life. It's an ocean moon, it's an ocean world. It has heat from being in Jupiter's radiation belt and energy, and then also heat that comes from tidal compression as it's moving around in its orbit. Those are the three ingredients we think were essential for protozoic life on Earth. But you cannot answer those questions with one instrument. You need multiple instruments at the same time. And that's why in all of their matrices about the kinds of science they're going to do, they know they require multiple instruments to solve it. And thanks to the work that I'd done on the prior missions, they knew you can't just get there and say, okay, everyone share your data now. You have to build this orientation into the team from the beginning. This has to be the job of your heterogeneous engineering. So a lot of the work that I did on Clipper was to try to help them build a synergistic team and robot at the same time that would help them in achieving their synergistic science goals. This included a culture that was rolled out around the team as the one team philosophy. It also included instituting gift economies and sharing economies among resources like data sharing, but also mass, power, and even financial sharing among some of the principal investigators in the production of their instruments. It also included, because they'd read my prior book on the rovers, they thought it was very important to have a totem object that everyone felt committed to. And thanks to Europa's role in 2001: A Space Odyssey's sequel, they built themselves these 9-foot-tall scale models of a monolith, as you do, because they're in California, so they have access to like set designers. There's a few of these. They get rolled out for all the meetings, but they give out, like everyone has a monolith keychain. They give out monolith awards. At every ceremony, they hand over a bone ceremoniously to demonstrate how there's turnover on the team. But all of the aspects of the structures and the cultures of the team are oriented towards this kind of sense of synergy and the ability to say that this is a singular cultural and structural and scientific project. This also includes a social science journal club that we started among the team that helps them investigate the ways in which social science might assist them in the building of their systems, and data and instrument system sharing built in from the beginning, so that these instruments had to be synergized from the beginning. Now, I'll mention that what this requires is not a form of, this might seem like, oh, wow, there's a lot of social engineering. We don't like to do that. We tried that once at Irvine, and it kind of didn't work very well. Or, those kind of cities that you put planned cities, like they don't really work. But what I will say is this is not a kind of social intervention from the outside, but a form of heterogeneous engineering from the inside and alongside members of the team. Remember, I talked about that kind of sustained engagement and commitment. This came about through sustained interaction with members of the team at multiple levels, and it also required being responsive to new issues as they arose. For instance, these kinds of flatter hierarchical teams are actually much worse at diversity metrics than more hierarchical teams. So how do we put in some form of countervailing pressure that allows minorities and women to move up through the ranks of this mission over the longue durée? And it also requires being open to a highly interdisciplinary orientation. I do want to mention before I leave the NASA case study that I did say that there were those two different forms of doing the science, and I didn't want to say one was better than the other. And it looks like here we've just implemented one whole cloth. Well, I do want to say that what matters here are the goals of the mission. We did so in this mission because it was the only way to achieve the synergistic science. But on another NASA team that I've been working with, I was trying to send an interstellar probe, a probe out to the interstellar medium beyond the area of influence of the sun to follow in the footsteps of Voyager. Many of them were on Voyager. Some of them are in their 90s because they have a very old spacecraft out there in the solar system. But the point here was that I used many of the insights from the Saturn team to inform how this spacecraft needed to be designed. Because if you want something to last for the 50 years it'll take to get out there, when everybody planning it now is dead, right? They're not around anymore. You need an organization that will scale over time. And the only organizations we know that do that are not collectivist ones. They don't have charismatic leaders. They're bureaucracies, right? Thanks, Weber. I can see the sociologists in the audience. They're like, oh no, Weber again, the ghost of Weber in space. So bureaucracy is unfortunately the only social system we have that we know works. So here the question was, how do we set up a functional bureaucratic system in which there are offices that people can move through and be promoted through, that have mentorship going both ways, and that as in junior to senior and senior to junior, and that allow for the kind of longevity that this mission is going to need. But we're doing that alongside thinking about the technical system requirements as well. What do we do to investigate emulation, right? So seeing as that your spacecraft is going to be 50 years old, do you think they still have the same software and file formats? No way. The people that built that spacecraft that flew past Pluto and showed the beautiful Pluto heart, there was a point where they got on eBay and they bought every single PC that was released in 1997 they could get their hands on, because they knew as soon as one piece of the ground system went down, they couldn't upgrade it. You can't fix that thing that's millions of miles away on the fringe of the solar system. So how do we build longevity into the organization? And how do we also build it into the technology, heterogeneous engineering at the same time? I'll note this also has a cultural component, that we had to orient the team towards the long now as opposed to the pressures of the immediate moment. This includes such team productions as, I don't know if you've ever seen these, the Protect Patel watches. You never actually own one, you just look after it for the next generation. So we produce these kinds of, along with the team produced these kinds of images that were like, you never actually own an instrument on an interstellar probe, you just look after it for the next generation, to get away from that mentality that the PI owns the instrument and basically is with it until they die. We also included visual demonstrations of not just how far the probe has to go, but which generations are going to be in charge when it gets there. And the boomers realized really quickly that it wasn't even Gen Z that was important, it was whatever came next, right? So showing these visualizations over and over again with the team reinforces, along with a series of other cultural practices like interviewing and heritage-oriented, different kinds of sort of time capsules and so on the team, has oriented them towards this kind of cultural sense of longevity, a structural ability to manage longevity, and the technical ability to manage longevity all at the same time. And this is drawing from insights of those studies of those prior spacecraft teams for whom these outcomes just kind of fell out as a process of doing the science. But now we can actually intentionally build them in. So I'm not going to spend as much time on the next two projects as I just did on NASA. But I want to remind you that what they have in common here, certainly what I've seen in the NASA missions and what I'm seeing in the other projects, is that those social theories become really essential for not only describing the practice of behavior in groups, but also maybe being predictive and maybe being design mechanisms for working on the kinds of teams we may want to assemble. That they take a highly constructivist approach to heterogeneous engineering. This isn't an impact thesis, this is definitely about inputs. And also the sustained work that I've been doing with NASA at this point for well over 2 decades. So let me move this forward into 2 totally different, apparently, areas that I've also been working on over the last several years. Still with me? Still happy? Still awake? Cool. I want to take you back to about 2012. when these ads started to appear on the New York City subways and MTA buses, because Google was changing its privacy policy. And no longer would they allow the things you did on YouTube to stay on YouTube, and the things you did on mail to stay on mail, and the things you did on search to stay on search. They were now going to amalgamate your data across all of their platform services in order to deliver you personalized ads. And you may not be able to read this from here, but this is Google being like, good to know. Here's how to stay safe online. Be more secure on the web. Your data on the web makes websites more useful, and it makes Google services more useful. Manage your data and what you share with Google. This was 2012. The rise of surveillance capitalism came about following the massive financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And this was the moment when, in the wake of that crisis, personal data became naturalized as the currency of the web. This was a moment when companies like Google and Facebook decided to plan for preference-based advertising and marketing and rolled it out at scale. This was also a moment where at Princeton, I was part of a series of conversations that also engaged government regulators and people in industry, right? So this was not like some conversation happening in a corner. This was like a significant conversation about big data in which people like Arvind here at Princeton, but also LaTanya Sweeney over at Harvard and Ed Felton and others explained things like the 3 degrees of entropy problem. That is, when you have big data, even if it's big, you're not lost you're not like a pin in the proverbial pin in the haystack. When you put 3 data sets together, even when they're large, you can de-anonymize and identify people. So in fact, there were serious dangers associated with putting this data together on the web. But the tech companies went ahead anyway. And they've now naturalized this form of data capture and processing, and we're using it to build artificially intelligent systems. Is it possible to do it any other way? Well, here are some things that bothered me about this moment at the time. And they were not just about privacy or about democracy or about surveillance. They were about social theory, because I'm that kind of nerd. So one of the things we know from Goffman, another major social theorist from the middle of the 20th century, is that society only works because we can play different roles for different audiences at different times. Collapsing those data infrastructures would make it impossible to patrol your ability to play different personas at different times and different places, and would actually fundamentally undermine the fabric of a functional society. Secondly, from Foucault, a French theorist in the 1970s, people behave differently when they believe that they're being watched. This is where we get the concept of the panopticon, and that institutions are disciplining us into particular forms of behavior through surveillance and monitoring. Even if it's not active surveillance that you know you're being surveilled every day, there's a kind of passive sense that you never know when the eye of Sauron is upon you, and therefore we will discipline ourselves into good, in this case, capitalist citizens. And finally, Bourdieu, a more recent French theorist, who describes the problem with preference-based advertising, which is the things we think of as unique to us, our tastes and our preferences, are not unique at all, but they're markers of social status, social group belonging, and in fact are really important for reproducing those same distinctions. So if you want to break down barriers between different social groups and social classes in society, if you're interested in equality, you're interested in diversity, preferences are actually entirely the wrong way to go. So with these kinds of problems in mind, I've faced some challenges in trying to adopt these systems. And I will say that there are numerous solutions to these problems afoot today, and I support every single one of them, whether that's designing towards value or privacy or autonomy, investigating responsible governance or democracy, de-biasing these systems, or regulating these systems to rein these in. But I'm also interested in that society-first design approach. What happens if we take those social theoretical principles first and use those to build alternative systems? So the opt-out project, as I describe it, is a series of personal experiments that have taken place in my life over the last 12 years, with an N of 1 largely, but aimed at radical data ownership while not giving up the benefits of a rich online life. I went off Google in 2012. That was it. Those ads were the last straw. We broke up, and I've never looked back, and I've never been happier. When I first became pregnant with my children, I bought everything in cash with these Amazon gift cards and did all the surfing for, baby-related things on tour. That was an experiment that went viral in 2014. which is kind of the opposite of being private, but that escaped everyone's notice. I started building, this is the first cell phone that I built. It didn't totally work, but not because of me, but because it was hard to get it on a network ultimately. So I've since then experimented with a range of alternative smartphone systems, including early like Ubuntu touches, and now regularly run Linux on my phone. If you're interested in phone hacking, I'm totally happy to answer questions in the question period. I've also been part of the communities resurrecting, like tracking smartwatches that don't speak to the cloud. I've built a lot of my own cloud systems and run those at home, including a voice assistant, et cetera. Now, these kinds of experiments are not just about privacy or democracy or democratic rights, the values of autonomy, or free information. For many of the people that build these systems and that critique these systems, those are absolutely the premise. For me, these are data practices that are premised on the kinds of social theories that guarantee well-functioning societies, right? Separate personas, the right to operate as separate personas in different spaces, the right to keep those data sets separate, the right to be belonging to participatory economies instead of extractive ones, where my connections are being mined for someone else's benefit, as opposed to being supported for my own benefits. Resisting panopticism and the kind of clamping down that does on your behavior, and especially not participating in the grand preference sorting. Increasingly, with the rise of racialized digital capitalism, we see that the kinds of data that would be extracted from me, a white woman in New Jersey, is going to have deleterious effects on a young black man in, say, Atlanta, trying to figure out if he can go to college. And I don't want to participate in any of those kinds of sorting systems. So instead, I've built my tech stack differently. I live a very bizarre technological life. This is a series of smartphones that I currently use, premised on the people formerly known as Nokia. These were Debian-based smartphones released in 2011, actually the most beautiful smartphone of all time, and then other versions of it leading up to the present day. So you can build differently. I started blogging about this at the optoutproject.net. It's pretty great, but there's a couple of major issues that come about once you start working on the opt-out. That everyone thinks the opt-out is kind of an individualistic experiment. And it kind of is in the sense that this is, I do live a very strange life. But you can't do any of this alone because technologies are fundamentally social projects. I mean, no one person can build a rover that goes to Mars. It doesn't work that way. You have to work in groups. But also, the Social Construction of Technology program tells us that it's social groups working together to solve different problems that come up with alternative technological solutions. So in fact, we need to engage with like-minded communities to build the kinds of alternatives that might challenge big tech today. Groups on the big tech platforms are there to keep us connected to very dysfunctional tools. The fact that you have to sign into certain kinds of systems in order to access your doctor's office or for your kids to go to Google School or whatever. But at the same time, we can also leverage the power of communities to build tools that support our relationships and support our autonomy and our connections. And these can weave us together in far more enchanting ways. So in many ways, the opt-out project stopped being about getting away from bad technologies and more about opting in. But the opting in wasn't just to a specific tool, it was to the community behind it. So I'm not just using the Linux smartphone, I'm participating in the community that is building that smartphone. And many of the tools here, the Rebel Alliance that hacks Pebble smartwatches and has rewritten the firmware, the Mycroft open source virtual assistant, the Sailfish phone, these are all projects that rely a lot on community infrastructuring, that have alternative corporate arrangements, have a foundation model or an open source model. And these are all trying to build in community alternatives that challenge the big tech paradigm. So in the opt-out projects, I've been thinking again about society first. That is, what kinds of technologies might I adopt and include that are premised on the social theories that describe more functional social interactions than the ones that we have built over the last 10 years? In what ways can we engage in a constructivist project to build alternatives into the market and into the future of technology? And then in what ways can we be engaged in sustained work with these communities to build those technologies that might provide a challenge? To wrap up, I want to give you one last example of this kind of thinking. And this is a project conducted as part of a Princeton course in 2020 called Can We Build Anti-Racist Technologies? And here the goal was not so much to build along the lines of existing kinds of frameworks, but instead to use social theory to undermine or to challenge the ways in which society currently operates. So as it's been well described here and elsewhere, we know that there are significant problems with technology and racial discrimination, again, expressed as a kind of technology impacting society problem. The technology is increasing or heightening our racialized biases, etc. We can't ask technology to solve these problems for us. That would be a more deterministic lens. It would be more of an impact view. But what can we do with an input view? So there are rich social theories of race and racialization processes that describe how we build these distinctions into our own social systems. Can we use those social theories as a premise to guide the building of alternative tools? In this case, tools that aren't there to just be not racist, but to undermine the practices and processes of racialization and envision alternatives. The theories we're building on here is not so much the old white man canon of social theory, but largely new premises in social theorizing around the institutionalization of race. Specifically, people like Bonilla Silva, who's a sociologist at Harvard, who talks about how racial categories arise from a stratification process that builds race and racialization into social institutions, so that our institutions carry with it the kinds of distinctions that we make as a social stratification in our social lives. This carries through to Ruha Benjamin's work, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you in this room, in which she describes how there's no glitches in these systems, that inequalities then become built in as what she calls the new Jim Code. And those inequalities can get built in because these technologies are kind of institutionalizations. They're participating in the stratification process of racialization. And then we were also inspired by Ibram Kendi's idea that maybe instead of just being not racist, let's try to reduce the bias in these systems, we might try to undo racializing projects. We might try to build things that challenge racialization as a process. So I encourage you to have a look at this paper we published at CHI a couple of years ago. But the students were incredibly creative in trying to come up with systems that might hold the powerful accountable for their actions and undermine racialized authorities or institutions while envisioning some alternatives and possibilities for the future. The image here on the left is an augmented reality system that changed the name of buildings on campus that were named after former slaveholders and participations in a racial order to names that were named after prominent alumni of color, including Michelle Obama and Sonia Sotomayor. The image on the right was a form of intervention into online advertising that flipped the script, and instead of allowing the companies to show you what they wanted you to see, it would show a little tidbit about that company. In this case, Google advised mental health care when workers complained about racism and sexism, right? So a way to kind of hold the powerful accountable for their work in upholding these structural inequalities as institutionalized practice. And the result here was really to challenge the way we do design, to use those social theories to think critically about what's built into our own practices of design, especially in design thinking, especially trying to get things rapidly prototyped or to market, what this means about when we premise issues of capital or ease of access of a community to the design process, but also came up with a series of alternatives and ways we might productively design using social theory against that institutionalized racism vein. So again, an example of putting the society first through theorization, constructivism, and then sustained work that really involved, in this case, not only engagement with communities on campus, but reflexivity in the design process, trying to understand what is it about the process that we were constantly fighting while we were trying to build these technologies, and what does that say about how design itself participates in racialization practices. So when we take this approach to sum up, and again, I've given you a lot of different examples, but I've tried to show you the different ways in which this approach might be valuable for the production of more socially responsible and just tools. When we take this approach, it allows us to move away from that individualism, the idea that it's just bad apples or ethics or psychology that's going to solve the problem. It also addresses some limitations in our current design thinking that pushes for alternatives. First of all, the kind of deeply embedded ethnography with communities that ends up building really rich tools, but without a sense of how those might generalize to other locations. Or a values-based approach that says we're going to go for good governance, right? But whose value is that good governance? Which version of that? What's it doing for that community? And is that extensible to all cases? And also, it goes against this kind of sense of the outrage machine and criticism. There's a lot of criticism of technology out there, but it doesn't necessarily point us towards alternatives. It's not grounded in what could alternatives and alternative tech look like if it was built along these lines. And one of the things I love about design practice with technologies, especially like critical HCI, is that it's so, it's so much easier to infrastructure these tools, easier relative to like building spacecraft hardware. Because this is about code and because this is about communities, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us in building these kinds of tools that show that alternatives are possible. So when we switch to the input view as opposed to the impact view, we can see ways in which social theorizing and social theory can structure or knit together our communities in healthier ways involving these tools. So the technologies aren't the kind of like production of dysfunction, but they're knitting us together in really cool and interesting ways. When machines and humans interact, it's never a one-way street. It's never just an impact. But when we engage in heterogeneous engineering, when we engage in reflexivity, when we engage long-term with communities, we can respond to those kinds of challenges as they arise. And we can think critically and I think in a really exciting way with participants on the ground about what's possible. That empirical work, that connection with community, that reflexivity, that observation and experimentation is central to the process for building not only something that's responsible to the community of practice, but also a responsible use of social theorizing. And ultimately, this kind of society-first approach can enable more productive and participatory worlds. So we're always weaving society and technology together in interesting ways. Why would you just build it and see what havoc it wreaks and then, absolve yourself of responsibility when you can premise your technologies on healthier lines to begin with? And hopefully this society-first approach can show the way. Thanks.
So I'm going to be the question runner because we're trying to record this. If you have a question, Tad or I will run over to you with a microphone and give you an opportunity to ask it.
Go for it. Hi. Oh, yeah.
So with this style of the line of bureaucracy, the way that I look at bureaucracy as a sociologist, so I see it something that can stifle creativity and innovation at times because it's outdated.
Yeah.
This being said, how can this style encourage continuous growth and exponential advancement if you want to continue improving something to be passed down through generations?
Yeah, I love this question. So there's two things I'll say there. One is that when we talk about bureaucracy today, we think about the DMV, and then we're utterly frustrated. And bureaucracy has really fallen out of favor as an ability for innovation. If you go back and read Weber, he thinks it's the greatest because it's so much better than just a bunch of dudes out there on the army field doing whatever they want. The Prussians figured it out, and he's going to send that to the world. So I think the second thing to say about that is there is no perfect social system. They're all bad at stuff. Right? They're really good at some things and really bad at others. On Europa Clipper, they were okay, we want this kind of participatory thing, but diversity is really important to us. And there's a huge contest in the literature about whether or not these groups are better or worse for women and minorities. Well, it looks like they're kind of worse in a lot of ways. So if you know that's a countervailing pressure, how do you push back against that? What kinds of infrastructure can you put in place to say, okay, this is how we're going to manage the careers of juniors to make sure that diversity is actually central to that project? And that's the same thing with interstellar probe. It is a problem with bureaucratic systems. They can end up becoming really siloed. And then the right hand and left hand don't know what each other is doing. So in what ways can we continue to infrastructure cross-communication between these different groups? The Saturn team actually adopted a matrix organization, which is one of the ways that that's resolved in engineering firms. It has its own attendant complications, but it can be an effective way of cutting across those silos by saying, okay, everyone has their primary responsibility in these different groups, but we're also going to get together in these cross-functional groups to enable exchange and idea exchange among those different teams. So that was one of the ways in which we sort of pushed okay, you're going to need the bureau system, like this is your job, and then you will exit that job, and someone else will take over. And that's going to be okay. I'd like to let you know that these people on Voyager, the PIs of the principal investigators of Voyager, those of them that are still alive are in their 90s, and they're still the PI. There was never a plan to hand over the baton. There's no baton handing in planetary, okay? And when I describe this to my friends who study other organizations like banks or whatever, I mean, their jaws are on their floor. They're like, there's no new CEO. I'm like, no. It's a lifetime appointment, and it's also described as a life sentence, right? That's it. So the challenge, the reason why the bureaucracy was important was because it enabled them to start thinking about, no, it's not a person who has a job. It's a job that has a person that moves into it, and then that person moves to another role. And that's going to be okay. And we're also going to institutionalize that in an organization and in a community that has not seen that before. So that's where the advantage of the bureaucracy is, but also those cross-functional groups were an effort to kind of push back against the pressure of siloization. Great question. Want to see that visualization? I have it here. This is the one where they have the boomers and the Gen X and stuff. This was the moment when everyone was like, oh no. Everyone in the room with gray hair was like, oh dear.
So when you ask a question, don't forget to introduce yourself, just in case Janet doesn't know you.
Hey.
Hi, Janet. Chris McPherson. Thank you. The two groups, spending a little more time on that, was it intentional that they were designed in two different ways? Was that a self-awareness decision, or did they evolve organically into
Good
those
question.
kinds of groups?
It's a yes and no answer. Yes, in that the head of the Mars team was also a member of the Saturn team, and he didn't like how it was done on Saturn. And he said, this can't be good for science. I'm going to do it a different way. So when he set the team up, he had the authority to do it differently. But the no is because there was a structural opportunity for change at NASA in the 1990s. It came in with a major recession. In 1992, they had a new administrator. It was the Clinton era. And this was the time of faster, better, cheaper, which you might have heard of as part of NASA history. We're going to design more spacecraft more quickly, more cheaply, no more of these huge Battlestar Galacticas going out into space that cost us billions of dollars, like James Webb, which is $10 billion and 10 years late, but whatever, it has really nice screensavers. No more of that. We're going to be fast and agile and nimble. One of the things he did was produce a new program called Discovery at NASA, where you could fly a mission for $150 million, which is not a lot of money for space. And they had to be sort of more nimble, but they also had to be assembled by a single PI. And what that meant is the prior missions, including the Saturn team, have been assembled under one set of priors. We're going to have a big thing, and everyone's going to have their own instrument on it, and then off you go into space as this arranged marriage, and that's how it is. But the Discovery program allowed this whole new moment in NASA where a single principal investigator could say, I'm going to create my own team, and this is how I'm going to run it. And interestingly, each of those PIs drew on really different resources to do that, because they're scientists. They're not they don't have MBAs, fortunately or unfortunately. But so the PI of the Mars team had been in an improv theater guy in high school, and so for him it's a flat. The leader of the troupe is there to get everyone doing the yes and exercise, right? If any of you have ever done improv, that's how those troupes work, right? And that's how his team worked. Similarly, the leader of Dragonfly, which should launch to Titan in a couple of years and fly a quadquadrant drone on a moon around Saturn, which is totally cool, is led by this totally amazing woman who's a semi-professional competitive rower. So she assembled her team like a boat, right? I mean, you're all rowing in concert, and there's the cox who's calling you on, and you probably know more about rowing than I do, but that's what she's doing with her team. So it allowed for more experimentation. But it was still kind of willy-nilly. I don't think anyone went into those missions being and this will be our science outcome. They went into those missions with these particular ideas about how it should be done. But what I discovered about the outcomes were things that they would not have predicted. And that's what's kind of interesting to then leverage that as okay, next generation mission, maybe we can choose more intentionally than just oh, that's how the funding worked, or I did theater in high school. Good question.
Over here, Janet.
Yeah.
My name's Alex Randall. I'm an alum of the university and professor at another university.
That's
I
cool.
really want to commend you on your N=1 science work.
Oh, thanks.
It is absolutely one of the most important things to go on for social scientists to all pick some domain of interest and monitor it for a lifetime. To study something around them, not just what this survey said. Margaret Mead used to say that a case of one is a case. And she used to say that the hardest thing to get in science is longitudinal data. My question is, do you have any other N=1 cases to tell us about? And I hope everybody here is doing some kind of N=1 lifetime study. If you just write your dreams down every morning or monitor your blood pressure or something.
Oh my gosh, good question. Like me or just in general? Okay, because I don't have time for other N=1s. That's a lot of hacking in my copious spare time with multiple children and a job at a university. What do I know of other N=1 projects? I think a lot of self-tracking studies are like that. I have a colleague at Cornell University who not only engaged in the study of self-trackers, but was also self-tracking himself, right? And that was a huge part of the study, was to do this kind of autoethnography alongside participation in groups. I think the kind of, I'm just going to study myself and do this kind of weird thing is not as commonly done in sociology and in social science. We tend to think instead about like participatory ethnography or autoethnography, ways to kind of structure that so that it feels more scientific and rigorous. That said, I mean, I think the inspiration for me in the opt-out projects was really critical technical practice. That is, what happens if you invert these assumptions? Then what, right? Is it possible to do it otherwise? And it turns out, yeah, it's possible, but it's really hard. It's really hard, it's really time consuming, it's really expensive. Those are all findings though, right? And then you can say, okay, if this is a lot of administrative burden on single people and it's really expensive, what do we do to change that? What should we build to change that? And I think also the idea that from the N=1, I discovered the importance of the many, right, is I think also essential, because I couldn't do the crazy opt-out stuff that I do without the sailfish community, without people that hack things with Raspberry Pis, without Plex, these are all projects that are done with community. Also, I couldn't do it with a strict orientation only towards free and open software. So this was the other thing that was interesting about it, is that when you do this N=1, but you come at it with different principles, I'm not there for absolutism. I know, Mako has well described that Google has my email because I send emails to people with Google addresses. So they do know. They don't have a single username around which they can warp and weft my whole life, but they have things. But additionally, if I just wanted to do things because they're free or open, I wouldn't be able to use Sailfish. You pay a licensing fee for it. The new version's based on Red Hat, not Debian. A fine distinction for some of you in the room. But I couldn't use some of the things that are being developed by for-profit corporations that also have a foundation, things like Mozilla, right? So you had to really then get quite specific about what are the values driving these other technologies, and then what are the things I'm bringing to the table. So what I love about the N=1 is not just the longitudinality, it's that every time you encounter resistances, it's an opportunity for investigation. What is that resistance really about? If you're interested in that too, I wrote a really great piece in Public Books 2 years ago now called Data Free Disney, about when I took my children to Disneyland but tried to do so undetected. That involved facial recognition, thwarting makeup and masks, and they got to choose their own pseudonyms, and I had a burner phone, and it was quite elaborate. But the whole point is a sort of takedown of convenience culture. What do you learn when you go to Disneyland with that kind of opt-out apparatus is all of this stuff in your pocket is oriented towards convenience, capitalism, efficiency of time and money. And it has you oriented that way so that you neglect this other data sucking work that's happening at the same time. So that you think that's an easy trade. But so many of those conveniences are micro conveniences. They're not really convenient. They're not really saving you time and money. You just saved 30 seconds off a line. I don't know if that is really worth giving all your data away. So I wish I could give you more examples of really robust N=1s. I'm happy to engage in conversation about that if other people have them. But I can say that those were the insights that came about from that experiment that are still ongoing. I'm trying to build an e-reader next. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. This
You're
was
welcome.
like mind-blowing in every way. I'm a first year in
Hey,
SPIA,
welcome.
so like not
Great.
this is like so foreign to me. But I have kind of a two-part question. One is I feel like a generational difference between my parents and people my age are they live and they have phones, but people my age live through their phones, and I think I know so many friends who can't go an hour without it. And
I'm sorry we did that to you.
and COVID, if there's a dual forward.
It was a double whammy.
Double whammy. And I'm curious what you recommend to disentangle what seems like such an inextricable bond with what's in your back pocket, and especially like for people who don't even view surveillance capitalism as a problem. They view it solely as a convenience, not like just a micro convenience. But like, oh, they save money on TikTok Shop, for example. And then the second part of this is, as a university student, I'm also seeing so many people who are going to the real world, having really amazing ideas and being really inventive, or even leaving college to move to California, for example, and start something new. But how do you recommend we standardize this process of thinking about the societal implications of your technology before you go off and find seed funding, which a lot of my friends have been doing?
Go get seed funding. Welcome to Princeton. We're so excited you're here. It's a great question, and the answer is basically, I think my answer would be the same. It's people and relationships first. When I taught critical studies in HCI at Princeton, and like we come to the end of the class and the students have this like mind-blown experience of alternative design premises. And then they're like, now what? One of them signed to go work for Palantir. 3 of them are going to Microsoft, and 2 of them are going to Google, like next week. And 5 of them are already at Facebook, on the side, right? They're like, well, now what? And I think the thing is you have to do this work in community. And however you sustain that community, because that network is going to enable those changes to grow. A lot of work is currently being done, especially by people in this generation, in the kind of spare time as this kind of like pro bono hacking projects, largely because you're trying to build your portfolio on like GitHub, right? Because whatever you're doing for a company, you can't put on GitHub, but you can put your own things on GitHub. So a lot of people do community work. So find the right communities to engage with so you can build your portfolio that way, because you're also building into those community networks. In terms of what to do when like you live through your smartphone, I am so sorry. It was intentional. And the thing that makes me so angry is we argued against it. Like there were people every step of the way who were like, no, this is a bad idea because it will produce these bad effects. And then it did. Exactly as we predicted. And we're seeing this now with AI, right? I mean, there were entire ethics departments staffed by like my friends and colleagues at places like Google and Facebook and then Microsoft, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, age of AI, thanks so much, we're shutting that down, it's all cool. So they know what they're doing and why they're doing it. But I think, again, if we put the technology first, we miss seeing the society part, right? And I argued this recently on a panel at the Knight Institute with Dana Boyd and Tressie McMillan Cotton, but like our institutions are broken. And so the technologies we're using are amplifying this kind of broken institutions. If you look at the society first, like society is frayed. Some of that was already there before COVID, and COVID broke a lot of other stuff. The fact that we're reaching for these tools to repair those bonds, the tools can't repair the bonds. It's society first, then technology. So whether you reach out to your contacts in your family through your phone, or whether you talk to them personally, like engage in the relationships. That's the most important thing. And then the additional thing I'll say about that is it's not the smartphone that's the problem. It's the particular smartphone, the particular apps. Because like I have a smartphone and it doesn't monopolize my life. It does everything your smartphone does. You know that thing where like your phone was listening to you and it gives you an ad based on the thing that you just said to your friend? Never once, ever. I've never had that happen. It is possible to live like that. It's a little more complicated, but if you do that in a group, you can still get away with it. You'll have to be like, you have to make trades though. You have to be okay with the fact that it's going to be like a blue circle in the chat, and you're not as good as like at MMSs as everyone else. Who cares? Who cares? Whatever, I'll take the blue circle. But I would say premise the relationships first, build the communities first. You pick the tools that support the community, if you can. And then move to systems like Signal. Yes, thank you.
Janet, thank you so much. My name is Jennifer. I'm a resident of the community, and I worked in IT implementations for large-scale corporations for many years in my career. I'm quite familiar with a lot of what you said.
Hi, welcome.
Completely resonated with what you were saying. I'm sharing an anecdote. It's not a question.
Go for it.
For people and relationship reasons, especially for the young person who asked the question earlier, the student, for people and relationship reasons, in 2003, my husband and I decided to stop television. So
Great.
we have no television in our home. For people and relationship reasons, in 2009, I got off Facebook. And for
Great.
people and relationship reasons, and to not go down the rabbit hole where my husband and I tend to go in terms of news, politics, etc., we get our news paper at the local public library. So these are three. They might sound, n equals 2. Definitely haven't done anything near to what you've done. I so admire what you've done. Thank you for
Thanks.
sharing that.
You can do it
But
too.
in our way, we've done it, and it's wonderful. So I still have a phone, but I don't live on it. And it's been 20 years that I haven't had TV ads in my brain and my home, and it makes a difference.
Isn't
So
it amazing?
it is amazing. So I definitely not am proposing something that wouldn't work for you, but we've done it, and it's been a great journey for 20 years.
I think the surprising thing when I got off Google is, like, on the one hand, everyone thought I was a Luddite, and not like the neo-Luddite that's cool now, but like, oh, you're just not tech savvy, and I'm a girl, so I look like I don't know computers, right? So I would, show up late to some meeting, and people would be like, I'd be like, I'm sorry, I had trouble because I had to like piece together how to get here and which subway to take, and what, like it didn't work, and I don't have functioning maps on my phone. I'd be like, oh, it's really easy. You just do this thing. I'm like, I know, but I'm not doing it that way. And then they would get really confused, because if you're tech savvy, like surely you would do it, right? And I was an early adopter my whole life. I ran a BBS for my high school in 1992. I was on the internet when it rolled out to Canada, which was later than here, sorry. But like, sorry, did you hear it? But I always had the coolest and the latest. And to suddenly be like, actually, no, to heck with that. It doesn't matter. I have to premise other things to be healthier and happier and not participate in a world that I don't want to see coming. I can see it coming, and I don't want it. I don't want it for me. I don't want it for my kids. I don't want it for my students. I don't want that. So there are individual things you can do. I love that you said you did it with your husband, because I think doing it together really helps. I also have a husband who's a total aiding and abetting force when it comes to opting out. But I'll be like, I think I need another Raspberry Pi, and he'll be like, he's not like, what for? But, oh, me too, which one? I was thinking of this other thing too. So like, it's a collaborative project. And it's collaborative with these extended communities. You couldn't look at the newspaper if you didn't have the library, right? I mean, these are the networks that we should be re-engaging with. And for a long time, we let them languish because we thought the digital revolution was the most important thing, because we were putting technology first as opposed to society. It is possible to use technologies that make your life better. I can say that I use them every day, and I love my tech stack, and I don't care when it breaks. I actually think it's great. I bought a house that turns out is a Faraday cage. I didn't know that before I bought it, but I was like, that's pretty great. I'll roll with it, right? Like, I think, again, the community work, re-engaging with our relationships and choosing the tech that works for us should be our fundamental right. And when we're not able to do that, when we have to use, as my child had to use Google Classroom for school, and mommy was like, all right, I'm going to teach you how to build a computer and install Ubuntu and put Firefox on here that's so locked down that it's never going to know what you're doing. When you have to do that, you only give them a piece of your life, not the whole of your life. They don't need to know everything. And I also always get this idea of like, oh, isn't it hard to remember all those passwords? Thing is, I'd rather remember a bunch of passwords. I'd rather even write them down on a Post-it in my house somewhere. I can't believe I'm saying this live, but I'd rather put it in a Post-it in my house somewhere than feel like I'm contributing to the continued erosion of the institutions that make social life possible. I'd rather do that. but I don't think it means you have to live in a cave. I don't live in a cave. It is a Faraday cage, but it's full of tech.
I'd like to thank Janet for coming by today. I think she's going to